The front door. After everything, how it sounds. He swallowed. I know. She thought of the nights they had spent on the rooftop, the two of them sharing cigarettes and dreams until the city blurred into some soft, endless stitchwork beneath them. She thought of the bracelet she had not taken off since her grandmother's funeral, the thin, braided silver Mr. Li had given her then, a quiet relic from a life she did not always understand how to hold. How many times had she imagined grinding out the small betrayals, and never this, the leaving? You lied, she said at last, because the truth was a steady, bitter arithmetic. You never told me you were leaving. You never— Did any of you ever think I would stand in the doorway and watch you decide to make me smaller? G's expression opened like a wound. I'm sorry, he said, the way a man prays for rain. I wish, if I'd known, I would have told you sooner, but it's complicated. Sarah has a job offer. We can start again. You can start again, Yanlu echoed. The room tilted. Where? Across an ocean, where everything you know of me is only a memory? You can start again, but who pays me back for the years you asked me to trust you with, for all the evenings you told me I was enough? She laughed once, a dry sound that belonged to another person. You taught me to share a life. You taught me to believe you wanted one with me. Sarah stood. I don't want to hurt you, she said. If there's anything— Anything— Yanlu's hand went to the bracelet at her wrist, fingers tracing the cold metal until she could not feel anything else. There is everything, Sarah. Do you understand that? Lin Tai found her at twilight, a presence more than a voice. He had come because he suspected that the socialite life suggested to the world some impermeable shell, and he had learned to read the fissures. They sat in a small noodle shop 2 blocks away, a booth drenched in fluorescent light and the grease-sweet scent of soy. You looked like you'd swallowed winter, he said, with the gentle malice friends allow. I did, she said. He left with an itinerary. Then let him go, Lin Tai said, the practical man of thrift and bruised patience. Let him go before he takes something else away. It was not as simple as his words. In the days that followed, the apartment seemed to live multiple lives at once. There was the tangible absence of G, his coffee ring on the balcony table, the crease on the cuff of a shirt he had never bothered to iron, and there was the more invasive absence, the sense of an inner map being redrawn. Yanlu found herself cleaning in rituals that mirrored grief, polishing the silver bracelet until it shined like a small metallic moon, cooking the recipes from her grandmother's dog-eared cookbook that smelled of star anise and old stovetop oil, pressing the pages between paper towels as if preservation could seal time. And then Mr. Li fell. He had been a figure in the periphery of her life for as long as she could remember, an elder who held keys and secrets, who moved with a measured gravity through the family rooms, who would, without ceremony, place a hot bowl of congee in front of her and glance into her face as if reading weather. Rumors had trailed him, that he had once loved and lost, that decisions in his past had cracked the family like ice on a river. Yanlu had never pressed. Respect was a currency she had learned to pay. The phone call came at midnight. She dropped the receiver as if its weight had been physical. Mr. Li had collapsed at his home. Dr. Lin was talking in clipped phrases through the static. Bleeding, unstable, rush to the hospital. Her feet knew the route before her brain did. Lin Tai and Grandma met her outside the emergency entrance, faces pale as unused porcelain. In the corridor, the hospital smelled of disinfectant and cheap coffee, a fluorescent light that made every color honest. Machines hummed and beeped like small, impatient beings. Mr. Li lay on a narrow bed, skin paper-thin under the sheet, an oxygen mask edge pressing grooves into his cheeks. A nurse moved around him with the practiced anonymity of someone who would later forget the names but remember the sounds. "He's weak," the nurse said, and the words were small cranes that could not bear the weight she meant to lift. "He vomited blood on arrival. We're stabilizing." Yanlu took his hand. It was cool and fragile, like the wrist of an old puppet, but he squeezed her fingers with a slow, stubborn warmth. She felt something uncoil inside her, a thread tied to the past, to the rooftop marbles and the recipe book and the pulse of family that had felt lately like a song she could not find the lyrics to. Mr. Li's eyes opened. They were the faded black of old lacquer. "Yanlu," he said, and his voice was a map of thin, reluctant roads. "You came." "I'm here," she said, and the hospital ceased to be a place and became a room in the house of her life, a place to hang up grief like a coat. "My time," he said, each syllable a small stone dropped. Later, when the fluorescent corridor quieted to a minimal hum, he asked for a pencil and paper. His writing hand trembled. He sketched a small symbol, 3 dots in a triangular line, then stopped, pressed his mouth. "There is a child," he whispered, eyes shutting as if each breath required crossing a threshold. "You never told me he was here," Yanlu said. "Who is he to us?" "He is more," Mr. Li's fingers twined with hers. "He is a link, a promise I made." He coughed, the sound like an animal startled behind glass. Dr. Lin's shadow passed in the doorway, a clinical constable. "Mr. Li," Dr. Lin said, gentle as someone choosing between curtains, "you're not to speak so much. Save your strength." But Mr. System. There was also a letter, folded small and crease-worn, in which he laid out a plan. How Jua's guardianship should be formalized, the origins of the small savings he had tucked in a bank where the name was different but the account was his to use, so that the boy would have a place to sleep and be fed. He asked Yanlu to be the kitchen of that child's life, to teach him how to make soup from the walk of the spoon to the heat, to let him know his laughter was not stolen property. His handwriting, in the end, regained youth, a slanted, eager thing. The world after the drive felt like a peeled fruit, raw and exposed. Yanlu moved through family meetings with a new gravity, lawyers who smelled faintly of cheap cologne, forms filled with the arbitrary language of custody, the soft insistence of Grandma that the recipe be placed somewhere safe. Jua was small and suspicious of adults. He liked marbles the way a child likes small, private planets. He watched Yanlu with a careful temperament that had already learned to measure entrances. There was a bruise on his arm where he had fallen on the stair that led to Mr. Li's tiny garden. No one had noticed it for a day. "Would you like to help me make the soup?" Yanlu asked him once, in the softened voice she used for birds and small animals. Jua nodded, serious as if agreeing to a treaty. She taught him how to tear ginger with the skin still on, how to let the spices float on top before stirring, how to taste for memory rather than precision. As the soup steamed, the apartment filled with the smell of star anise and onion and something else, something that felt like forgiveness being learned like a fold in a napkin. It did not make everything right. Words had been broken, and some things could not be undone simply by stirring a pot or reading a screen. G's absence was a hollow train that ran through her chest at odd hours. Sarah had gone on to her new life, and sometimes Yanlu imagined her across an ocean, carrying ambitions like sand. But in the small, mundane acts, she began to weave a new continuity. The marbles were placed in a glass jar on the windowsill. The bracelet was kept in a box on the piano. The cookbook was translated into nights where Jua would find a page and trace the stains like constellations. One evening, months after Mr. Lee's last breath, a day that tasted of rain and the ache of long windows, she climbed to the rooftop. The city spread out below, its lights a scattering of insect lamps. She took the marbles from the jar, warmed them in her palm. Each one caught the city in miniature, a neon strip, the dark of an alley, the flicker of a taxi light. Beneath her feet, the rooftop tiles were warm from the day, and for a moment she felt the tug of youth, the old desire to run away. But she did not run. Instead, she whispered to the small planets in her hand the kind of promises she had learned from Mr. System. Maintain a flux and the connection. Connect with old desire to run away. But she did not run. Instead, she whispered to the small planets in her hand the kind of promises she had learned from Mr. Lee. The promise not to hoard truth. The promise to teach the child who now sat at her table how to make soup. The promise to keep the memory of those who left and those who stayed. The bracelet felt cold at her wrist, then warmed, as if the metal itself wanted to be a small witness. A sound came from the stairwell, the slow, measured steps of Lin Tai. He leaned against the door, watching her like someone who has always known where to stand. "It's not an ending," he said, "because sometimes the truth is a relief. It's a place to begin again." She thought of the video, of Mr. Lee's failing hand, of G's quiet departure like a vanishing tide. She thought of what it meant to be left with a choice, to follow someone into an uncertain brightness, or to build a small, stubborn light where she stood. She looked at the marbles, at the city, at the bracelet, a loop of silver, a circle that refused to break. "Maybe," she said, and the word carried the weight of the entire city. "Maybe I'll teach him to make the soup that chases winter away. Maybe that will be enough." She let a marble roll from her fingers and watched it catch a glint of light, a tiny world that did not know of betrayal or loss, only the physics of motion. Below, in a corridor of the hospital where lives had once been reconsidered, someone rearranged a small tin on a shelf. In the kitchen, her kitchen, pots cooled and the cookbook lay open, a page bookmarked with a photograph of a woman Yanlu had never met, but whose handwriting smudged the page with the tenderness of a hand that had stirred 1,000 spoons.
In the months to come, there would be letters, legal appointments, and the occasional sharp ache when a bus stopped at an airport terminal and the world blurred into departures. But there would also be soup and marbles and the small persistence of ritual. There would be nights when she would look at a boarding pass she had once taken from a table and burn it in the sink just to hear the sound of the edges curl, to rid herself of the paper that pretended to be future. She turned from the city and held the bracelet like a small, stubborn promise. It had been given to her in a time that felt separate and yet braided into the same rope as now. It felt less like an ornament and more like a map. On the kitchen counter, a small USB drive sat inconspicuously in a dish, its tiny light dim and private. Mr. Lee's voice lived there, imperfect, tender, final. She pressed the drive against her palm and felt the faint thrumming of a recorded life. Outside, the city breathed its steady, indifferent breath of cars and neon and loneliness and kinship. She put the marbles in the jar, slid the cookbook onto the shelf, and turned off the lights, leaving the room to its small shadows.
There were other endings to reckon with. Legal forms signed, a child's first promise to remember, an apartment that had once held a trio and now held two. But as she closed the door behind her and the night settled like a soft linen sheet, Yanlu understood something she had not at the start. That love could be a refusal as much as a giving, that leaving could reveal what needed staying, and that forgiveness was not a single act but a house of small chores. She placed the bracelet on the piano and sat on the bench. The keys were cool. She pressed one down and let the note hang in the air. An unresolved chord that wanted but did not demand resolution. On the small glowing screen of her phone, an email subject blinked. G. Final message. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she reached for the USB, plugged it into the laptop, and watched the small file list appear. She found the video Mr. Lee had made and put his voice on again, letting it be a bookend to a night that had begun with betrayal and ended with the fragile architecture of responsibility. Outside, a distant taxi horn sounded like an off-key bell. Yanlu sat very still and listened to the recorded voice as if to a friend who had finally learned to speak plainly. When the message ended, she felt a thin, honest ache, one that would, she suspected, fold into the small, steady life she would now build. There were choices to make, rooms to arrange, stories to tell Jua about the woman with the silver bracelet and the soup that made winter leave. There were also truths she would have to tell herself about the man who had loved and then left, and why some departures are not theft, but surrender. She closed the laptop, placed the USB in its tin, and set the tin beside the cookbook. The marbles caught the faint moonlight like planets guarding a quiet orbit. Yanlu stood, and for the first time in many nights, did not reach for the phone. She breathed in, held the silence, and let the night settle.